It really makes me mad when I talk to students a week before their LSAT and they still don't know the difference between necessary assumption and sufficient assumption questions in logical reasoning. And I'm not saying that to be dramatic. These are some of the smartest students that you will ever meet. They've got top GPAs, great work ethic, but they still get this wrong because nobody ever sat them down and said to them, hey, those two words, necessary and sufficient, control the entire LSAT. And so that's what we're going to focus on today. In today's free LSAT class, we're talking about one of the most misunderstood distinctions in logical reasoning, the difference between necessary assumption and sufficient assumption questions. So today, I'm going to break it all down for you step by step. Then we're going to jump into some live drills together so you can test this out for yourself. Now, here is the simple one-sentence summary that can save you hours of frustration. Then we'll zoom out and look at it more big picture. Necessary assumptions are things the argument must have in order to work. In contrast, sufficient assumptions are things that, if true, make the argument guaranteed. So necessary must be true. Sufficient makes it true. That is it. That is the core difference. Necessary keeps the argument alive, and sufficient locks it down airtight. Now, most students mix up these two question types because both of them use the word assume. And our brains will go, oh, same word, same skill. But they are actually looking for completely different things. Necessary assumptions are like checking for oxygen. What must be present for life? Sufficient assumptions are more like building an airtight spacesuit. They seal everything in. And so you tell the difference between the question types based on the keyword or phrase in the question stem. Necessary assumption question stems will contain words or phrases like depends upon, requires, assumes, or presupposes. In contrast, sufficient assumption question stems contain words and phrases like if assumed, follows logically if assumed, properly inferred if assumed. And so here's your shortcut. If the question says depends on, they're asking for what the argument needs. If they say follows logically if, it's asking what would make it guaranteed. So imagine that you wanted to buy a $1 item. Having at least a penny is necessary because you can't buy a $1 item without possessing at least the value of a penny. In contrast, having $1 million is sufficient. It's way more than you would need, but it would get the job done. And then in the middle ground, having exactly $1 is both necessary and sufficient. So again, necessary is minimal and it's required. Sufficient is more than enough potentially. So every time that you face an assumption, a so-called assumption question, I want you to picture that dollar. Do you just need a penny to make it possible? Or are you looking for up to $1 million to make it guaranteed? Here's another way to think about it. Necessary is the floor. If you remove it, everything collapses. In contrast, sufficient is the ceiling. If you add it in, the whole structure is sealed. So here's your process for necessary assumption questions specifically. First, we confirm the stem to determine the question type. You want words and phrases like depends on, requires, and assumes. Then you find the core. What's the conclusion? And what's the evidence that supports it? Then you find the gap. What must be true for the conclusion to work? Then we use the negation test. You negate each answer and you see if the argument collapses. If it does, that answer was necessary. So, quick example here. Daily caffeine improves alertness, therefore it improves all job performance. Let's suppose we had a proposed necessary assumption. Improving alertness can improve some aspects of job performance. If we negate it and say improving alertness cannot improve any aspects of job performance, boom, the argument falls apart. And notice that proposed necessary assumption is moderate. And for this question type, we like moderate. For necessary assumptions, boring is beautiful. That's what we're looking for. We like words like some, can, likely, or at least one. Now, in contrast, sufficient assumption questions are the opposite. For these, we're not looking for something mild, we're looking for something powerful, a statement that guarantees the conclusion. Think of this as the bridge test. If you add this answer to the argument, the conclusion becomes logically airtight. No gaps, no wiggle room, no maybes. For example, all scholarship finalists have strong LSAT scores. Maya is a finalist, therefore, Maya will get into law school. What would guarantee that conclusion? If we learned as new information that all scholarship finalists are admitted to law school. That one line makes the argument unbreakable. And strong language is not only okay here, it's often required to guarantee the argument. So let's pause on that distinction because I think it's the key to unlocking this whole difference here. Necessary is more mild, sufficient is more bold. If a necessary assumption answer sounds too obvious, too easy, we already knew that, that's usually a good sign. In contrast, if a sufficient answer sounds too extreme, that's also usually a good sign. Your emotional reaction, your biases, your predispositions are often the opposite of what's correct. That's why the LSAT is so hard for so many people. It's about training you away from your innate predispositions, your instincts, your biases. You've got to unlearn your typical way of thinking. And the LSAT makers know that you love strong language. That's why they often put strong, sufficient answers before the necessary assumption in the choices. For example, there's this famous rattlesnake folktale question. You can Google it and you'll find it. In that question, one of the earlier answers is a powerful, sufficient assumption, and it's wrong. The right answer is a lot more moderate, appears later in the choices, but that is what is truly necessary. So I want you to, as you're going through these, slow down, don't go for the strongest answer, read the question stem, identify the task to perform, the job to be done, then you will evaluate them accordingly. Now, the four most common mistakes I see: mixing up the tool for the given job. For example, students will oftentimes incorrectly use the negation test on a sufficient assumption question or use the bridge test on a necessary assumption question. Negation is for necessary, bridge is for sufficient. Another big mistake is ignoring the question stem, jumping straight into the stimulus without labeling the task or the job to be done. Third big mistake, leading with emotions, picking an answer that feels strong instead of testing it out logically. And finally, not reviewing the patterns. If you miss one, if you get one wrong, I want you to write down why you got it wrong. And that last piece of the review is where the growth happens. We call this the Socratic review method, asking why until you can pinpoint the exact reasoning error. That's what our coaches drill into every single one of our students who hit a plateau. And high scorers just do three simple things. The process, the step-by-step. They label the question type before reading the argument. They slow down enough to test the logic, and they review every single mistake deliberately. That is it. And when you start doing that, assumption questions stop feeling random. They start feeling predictable. They feel easy, almost mechanical. Like they'll say to themselves, oh, the question stem says depends on? Cool. Now I know what tool to use. And you start feeling in control again.